In a country where governing party politics has long been defined by a powerful alliance, that unity is now under strain. For decades, the tripartite alliance, the ANC, the South African Communist Party and COSATU stood as the political engine of post-apartheid South Africa. But as the 2026 local government elections draw closer, that alliance may be coming apart. The SACP is growing increasingly vocal and making good on its 2022 and 2024 Congress and Special Congress resolutions to contest elections on its own instead of its traditional backing of the ANC ticket. But the results thus far have been far from impressive, raising questions about the party's prospects in the 2026 local government elections. Just this week, the party scored a mere 1% of the vote in the Fetakgomo Tubatse by-election, the same proportion it obtained in Julius Malema's home ward in Polokwane last month. Joining me in a moment to unpack this political moment and what it means for the future of local government is Professor Alex van den Heever, who is an expert in public governance and also local service delivery. But before we get to him, before we get into that discussion, let's listen to the SACP General Secretary, Solema Paila.
The SACP condemns all attempts to provoke such conflict. The SACP is not preoccupied with contesting the ANC, which remains an ally as long as we share strategic objectives both in theory and practice. Exercising our rights, the SACP will contest the 2026 local government elections to defend, advance and deepen the national democratic revolution in connection with the pursuit of socialism while confronting the failed neoliberal policy regime imposed since 1996 under GEAR and subsequent reformist policies. Those who invoke selective amnesia ignore that the SACP rescinded its short-lived initial statement on GEAR, replacing it not only with subsequent statements, resolutions and declarations, but above all, also with a consistent campaign against the policy.
We'll get into the discussions of how it all plays out. Let's speak to Professor van den Heever, who joins me in studio. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming through once again. We'll get into the clarity or lack thereof as to the status of the tripartite alliance in a moment. But I just want to get a sense from you. Does it appear to you that there is no turning back on this decision of the SACP to contest elections on its own ticket?
Yes, I think there is no turning back. I think they see this as a kind of a necessary move, given the drop in ANC's support. And that implies essentially that if you stayed in the tripartite alliance, your possibility of getting positions, etc., reduces. So now you kind of jump ship and see if you can do better on your own.
Mm. Is it as raw as that? Because they would clothe it along the lines of this is the culmination of frustrations about the alliance, things such as they've been calling for what they call a reconfiguration of the alliance for many, many years, and that wasn't forthcoming. But do you believe that it's also about saving yourself?
Yes, I think it's about saving yourself, because even in that comment, he's talking about something that happened in 1996. That's quite a long time ago, and it's a very slow reaction. Mm. So if you were making a principled decision, you'd do it in 1997 rather than in 2025 or 2026. So this looks, the question is, would they have jumped ship if the ANC was sitting at 50% plus? Mm. Probably not. Mm. But I think they see themselves as possibly part of coalitions going forward, and even if they get 1% or 2%, maybe they are a kingmaker in some coalition. And I think that's probably the calculation.
Yeah. So just in terms of the frustrations, though, if we address them objectively, have you observed these frustrations? I mean, it's been the SACP's cry that the alliance is not the center of decision-making, but rather the ANC, just goes into government and does what it wants, and they are then held collectively responsible by the electorate.
Yeah, it's a question. It's a bit like a government of national unity question. because they've actually been in quite a strong alliance, and many of them have been cabinet ministers and have gone into government and then have been part of the executive and executive level decision making as government. So, yeah, you can have party discussions and you can have government discussions where you are a party in government. And they have been a party in government with potentially more representation than the DA today. So they have been fundamental to decision making all the way through, and essentially have to take collective responsibility for the state of South Africa today. Because in many senses, their approach has been to prop up state institutions that have failed, and they have not been at the forefront of dealing with why those organizations have failed, and dealing with governance and dealing with making sure that those state institutions can contribute to the developmental state approach that they support. So they've been party to that failure.
Yeah, but they've been vocal about policy disagreements, right? I mean, in the midst of this conversation, I've seen quite a number of clips that are resurfacing of the then President of the Republic, the late former President Nelson Mandela, and Charles Ngakula when he was leading the SACP. And back then the contention was around gear. The SACP will say, we didn't stop there. When there was the ASKISAs and all the other subsequent policies, National Development Plan, we've been vocal, but it's had no effect in terms of swaying the direction in which the ANC has been leading the country.
I think I think that's there was a time when there would have been a decision under Mbeki and previously under Mandela, strongly also Mbeki's decision making that you could see behind a gear-like strategy and approach. But since then you've had Zuma and you've had Ramaphosa, and we've had a very strong developmental state approach. So it hasn't followed the gear type strategy, and what gear was doing up until 2006 and 2007 was fundamentally changed from 2008. Government's policies and approaches to how government runs there was a turning point.
Yeah.
And government's financial position has deteriorated considerably through those policies and approaches, which haven't been explicit policies, but the way in which government has been run, and they've been part of that. So I say I take some of those comments with a pinch of salt,
yeah,
because they could have made a huge contribution to South Africa by focusing on governance and performance of the very institutions they support and don't want privatized, and yet they have been party to their collapse.
Yeah. In fact, I must correct myself. The contention between Charles Ngakula's SACP and Nelson Mandela's ANC was around RDP, not GEAR, because GEAR then comes a bit later on. But, that's beside the point. The next question that I want to ask you then, are you any clearer as to the status of this alliance then? Because if we've all along contested elections as an alliance, and now we are contesting the same election, trying to get the support of the same electorate, that makes us competitors, no? But there's an insistence that the alliance will survive and will continue despite this new approach.
As we've seen with a number of other groupings that were part of the ANC that split away, I think their intention is to reconnect at some point, possibly, when they've accumulated enough electoral support. So I think they do see the possibility of an alliance going forward, but not one in which they have to sit in a party discussion and get approval from without having actual representation politically. So by explicit representation, I think they hope they can reconnect in a way in which they have a greater influence, potentially as they would in a coalition. So I think that their intention is to be coalition partners, with a very close link through theoretically having been part of this alliance in the past.
What would that do? Would it strengthen their voice in terms of swaying the policy direction of any government propped up in the manner that you described?
Yeah, so if we have if these coalitions don't involve the two largest parties, let's say ANC and DA going forward, then they're coalitions of lots of little parties and one big party. And in that, one party might make the difference to staying in power, and therefore you get quite a lot of leverage. So I think even if people end up with 1 or 2%, they've seen what's happened, you've got potentially quite a lot of say, and you can get influential positions out of that. But it also means in the policy discussions, potentially, but possibly also in the patronage discussions, you can have a lot of sway. You don't actually have to, this is part of the problem that we've had, is that we haven't necessarily seen incredible contestation around policy. We've seen contestation around patronage.
Yeah.
And that is a very strong driver for why people are involved politically. So this gives quite a lot of leverage. As I said, 1%, 2%, even 3%, you've got leverage.
So lastly then, Prof, are we to read anything into how tough the SACP has found the going in the few by-elections where they've contested? That one in Julius Malema's home ward, where they scored 1%, and now the Fetakgomo Tubatse municipality by-election, same margin as well. Is this an indicator, or should we not read into it, read anything into it, given that perhaps their full electoral machinery is yet to actually roll out?
Yeah, we'd have to see. I think that they're competing against other splinter groupings from the ANC in the past who have ground games that are probably quite effective. The SACP, it doesn't really have a brand that's very distinct from the ANC, so you might be seen as basically this is a vote for the ANC. And in by-elections, in the municipal elections, you're splitting the votes. So that in itself can be very problematic for who might have been the dominant player in particular municipalities, where 1 or 2% might actually make the difference. But I think that they are probably not going to do terribly well in these elections coming up. I don't think they've got that fundamental support. And in terms of the ideological positioning as a vote grabber, they've got competition on that score. Lots of people are kind of making the same noises and have a pre-existing ground game.
Yeah.
And in the places in which they're likely to compete successfully, those are more, it's going to be that ground game that wins.
Yeah. All right. Kola, thank you for coming through and this conversation. That's Professor Alex van den Heever, who is an expert in public governance and local service delivery. So the conversation is really picking up momentum around the elections and new political parties.